Continuing with the 16 truths about insulin resistance, the skinny on fats and aging and insulin resistance. What the heck is all that about? Well, you probably noticed in past videos that I had these words up on this particular screen. Those are words, they're all very small. Arachidonic acid, that's a big one. Seed oil, linoleic acid, otherwise known as seed oil really. Omega-3, omega-6, EPA, DHA, fish oil. I want these words to be part of your vocabulary. It allows us to talk about something that even doctors don't talk about. They try to make it simple. We all want simple. We all want effective. And that's not always the case. So the first step to making it simple and effective is understanding what we're talking about. These particular words are important. Let's go with it. Okay, so looking at age, HOMA-IR is how I measure insulin resistance. Anything above 1.4, insulin resistance. Anything below is not. So we're looking at that. We're going through omega-6 versus omega-3. And let's start with something we hear all about, the omega-6-3 ratio. It's really important, you know? It's really important. It's so important. It's like, let's look at it relative to aging. Okay, here's how we're going to look at it. We're going to look at omega-6-3 ratio in itself relative to aging. Then we're going to break them apart. Omega-6 relative to aging, omega-3 relative to aging. See what we find. And then we're going to break those apart into the two key fatty acids of each group. Arachidonic acid and linoleic acid, seed oil, and omega-3, EPA and DHA. It's a fascinating discovery, and I am sure you've not heard this before. And it's not so much that you haven't heard it before. I don't really care about that. I'm glad hopefully you'll learn something new. But it's how you're going to apply it going forward that it's directly and immediately going to benefit you. That's the whole point of these particular videos. Something simple enough, actionable enough, and effective enough. And all of these things I'm always going to be dividing into non-insulin resistance, non-IR people, and insulin resistance people, IR people, keeping it pretty simple. Okay, let's go. So the big picture is this. Omega-3-6 ratio, which is so important over the last 70 years, really since the 50s in Ansel Keys. Omega-6, I'm comparing, by the way, age versus pounds overweight, which we talked about before. So what we see is the worse or the higher your omega-6-3 ratio is, the heavier you most likely will be. You go, wow, that's interesting. That's pretty important. We should pay attention to it. Those who have 18-to-1, we're very overweight. So if I left you there and say, you tell me what that means to you. 6-3, you have too much 6 or too little 3? You don't know. Well, it's the ratio. So you're gonna, it's almost like an inactionable thing. You don't know how to address it. What if you had too much omega-6 and said, what do I do? Cut back on my omega-6, increase my omega-3? It's a little confusing and it's not quite that simple. But we're gonna break it down. What about to age? Age is just the opposite. It says, for those who live longer, are older, and you measure their omega-6-3 ratio, you're going to find that they have a lower. If I was to extend this trend line, where would that point to? Well, it would go up to probably about 75, and they'd have a 1-to-1 ratio. But most people that I've met in terms of real world, the best that I've seen was a 3-to-1, 3.5-to-1 ratio. I have not seen a 1-to-1. So anyways, that is the direction. So that's a conclusion we can make. The implication is the lower your 6-3 ratio, the longer you will live. We can't say that here with this data because it's all static, right? This is a picture in time of various people. What we can say is those who are older had a lower 6-to-3 ratio. All right, let's compare 6-3 ratio with insulin resistant people versus non-IR. Well, they end up pretty much at the same place, lower, right? So whether you're insulin resistant or non-insulin resistant, they get lower. Obviously, the big difference is for IR people, they were far worse to start with when they were younger. But if they lived older, in order to live older, or I should say specifically, those who were older were also insulin resistant, had far, far, far lower 6-3 ratio. All right, so now we're breaking them apart. Off to one side, omega-6, off to the other, omega-3. What do we see? So blue here is omega-6, and these are just undifferentiated, right? Just all a group of people. What do we find? Well, omega-6 increases as people get older. That is, those who are older, who lived up to 80, as far as my data goes, they had higher amounts of omega-6. Oh, wait a minute. What about that omega-6-3 ratio? Didn't that kind of say it was kind of omega-6? No, it was a ratio. Increasing omega-6, increasing fat, if you will, polyunsaturated fats, which is what this is more prevalent for those who live older. And what about omega-3? Omega-3 also increased, but it didn't increase as much. And by the way, we've talked about before, there's a lot more. The ratio between omega-6 just generally and omega-3 is almost like a 4-to-1. There's a lot more omega-6, linoleic, arachidonic. So that's why these lines are different. But the degree, the omega-6 goes up a lot faster, a lot higher for older people than does omega-3. Doesn't mean it's less important. Now let's break that down. The dotted lines are IR people, insulin-resistant people. They're above 1.4 homo-IR. They're insulin-resistant. What do we see? Those who are younger versus those who are older, the only thing different for them was they increased their omega-6. Their omega-3 was pretty much identical. IR, non-IR is pretty much the same line. It increased a little bit. So what do we have? From 2 to 3, 2.5 to maybe 5, maybe 6. So it doubled in the course of 60 some odd years. Whereas insulin-resistant people, a huge increase in omega-6. A huge increase in omega-6. So wait a minute, I thought seed oil is bad, and it just doesn't make sense. We'll get to that piece by piece by piece, but I just want you to see. But also when we have non-insulin resistant people, notice their levels really don't change. They're at a good level and they stay at a good level. So this is pretty much getting to the level that you need to be at, and this is what we're looking at, okay? So for non-insulin resistant people, they have good levels initially and they have good levels in the end, and those are pretty much the same levels. Insulin resistant people have to increase their levels, certainly of omega-6 and a little bit of omega-3. All right, let's go further. So omega-6 is linoleic acid, the vilified seed oil, and arachidonic acid, which is kind of vilified as well. It's supposed to be the pro-inflammatory omega-6, and watch out, that's all animal food. So linoleic acid does come from plants. Arachidonic acid does come from animals. Some linoleic acid, as I showed you in previous videos, does convert, but not like automatically. It does a lot of other things and some. And actually, the more linoleic acid one has, the lower their arachidonic acid. That's an odd one. So what do we see? So over the course of age, we find that insulin-resistant people increase their linoleic acid, whereas non-insulin resistant people really didn't change at all. I mean, all right, it's a slight change over 65 years? So I'd call that a straight line. A definite increase in linoleic acid for those who are older as opposed to those who are younger. What about arachidonic acid? Again, non-insulin resistant people had a good level when they were younger. They had pretty much the identical level when they got older. Pretty much no change. Pretty much a flat line unless you're going to get really nuanced. However, insulin resistant people, their arachidonic acid definitely increased the longer they lived. I wanted to mention this one thing. I mentioned supplements. I'm not a real big supplement doctor. I'm 30 years as a naturopathic doctor, and a lot of that has to do with diet and supplements for sure. Supplements are necessary for many people initially to make a change in their life. So to the degree that that is something that you are interested in, two things. One is, feel free to send me a question. It could be a topic I'd cover in the future. The other is considering joining our pharmacy, which is from Fullscript, but it's really part of a company that I've been part of for 30 years called Emerson that Fullscript bought. Don't need to know that, but I've been working with them or a part of them for nearly 30 years. Didn't think I was that old, but time goes by. But I trust them, and they have a huge variety of supplements. And the other thing is, I've controlled it and tried to keep the price low enough. It should be pretty much the cheapest place you can ever buy good quality supplements. So consider it. If you are interested in where do I get some good supplements, because he talks about this, that, or the other thing, that's where you can get them, and ask for my advice. The link to join our pharmacy is below in the show notes. Those who are older had higher amounts of arachidonic acid than those who are younger if they're insulin resistant. So arachidonic acid is a big mover here. Actually, both of these are big movers here. Both increased if they were insulin resistant. Both stayed the same if they were non-insulin resistant. Omega-3, okay, there's got to be a secret here, right? There's got to be a secret here. This is fish oil, EPA and DHA. We've talked about before that DHA is pretty much always at a higher level, about twice the higher level of EPA, right? So 2 to 1 if you want to compare the two. That's why we have two different levels here. Okay, EPA is the blue. Look at that one first. All right, solid line, non-insulin resistant people definitely goes up from, what is that, half to 1.5. There's so little EPA in our blood and certainly in our red blood cells, it does not increase. But that's a 300% increase, 1/2 to 1.5, 300% increase over 65 years. So that's significant. That's far less percent, but it still was an increase. What about DHA, which starts at what, a little under 2, call that, maybe it starts at 1 3/4, goes all the way up to coming up to 4. That's a double increase. Clearly significant. They both increase. And pretty much the same pattern exists for insulin resistant people as well. There's really not enough to argue that one is different. They all go up. Everybody increases, which that was not the case with the omega-6. Insulin resistant people definitely increased the older they were. If we're comparing older to younger, but not for non-insulin resistant people. For fish oil, EPA and DHA, everybody increases. Those people who lived older had higher amounts of fish oil, EPA and DHA, than they did younger. Across the board. Almost like no difference between the two. What else can we say? Here's the panel that I get from the Omega check that I do through LabCorp, which I'll be changing. I'm going to switch over to Omega Quant. They have a much better panel, more information. But however, what I want to point out is the mid-range for EPA is 1.2. It's very little. This is according to their range. My numbers are a little actually higher. In DHA, 3.25, arachidonic acid, 12. Notice this is almost an identical double. Linoleic acid, for their numbers, is twice the amount of arachidonic acid. And DHA is almost, by their numbers, almost, it's like 2.5 times, almost 3 times. Okay, and there's Omega Quant. I want to put their references there too. So you can see the ranges are considerably different. So from LabCorp EPA, it's 0.2 to 2.3. Omega Quant is a little lower and certainly higher. So these are different populations since they have different ranges. One's a bigger range. Doesn't invalidate anybody's information. It's still the same proportion. DHA, EPA, it's pretty clear. Those who live longer, those who are older that I tested, had higher DHA and EPA, regardless of insulin resistance or non-insulin resistance. That's amazing. So, easy rule. It's higher for those who lived longer. And the implication is it's relative to health, obviously. For those who were, and here we go, here's the midpoint between 3.2 right there, between these two. Here's age, and here's EPA midpoint for insulin resistant people. So there really isn't that much change between insulin resistance and non-insulin resistance. It's an easy rule. We all need to follow it. All right, so for those who lived longer, omega-6 doesn't change that much, but omega-3 changes a lot. That's a big deal. So when we look at the omega-6-3 ratio from the first screen I showed you, so what is changing here? For those who live longer, it's their omega-3 that is getting higher. Their omega-3 is getting higher, and their omega-6 is kind of status quo, specifically around arachidonic acid. Let's go deeper. So now just look at linoleic acid, because we said linoleic acid actually increased for those who are older. And the implication is it was required in order to be older to have higher levels of linoleic acid. Seed oil. Well, that's not the story you hear. Seed oil is bad. It gives you oxalams, oxidative linoleic acid metabolites. That's what they are. It's supposed to be bad, and bad for so many different things. It is bad in some things, and it is good in other things. So if you're interested in data, let's look at the data. If you're interested in a rumor, that's somebody else's business. Okay, linoleic acid. It goes up a lot if you're insulin resistant. It goes up now a little bit if you're not insulin resistant. The range, call that 25 for a midpoint for linoleic acid, 25. So is this a bad thing? Is this a bad thing to increase your linoleic acid, your seed oil? My data says it's a good thing. Those who live longer have higher amounts. And you could also argue maybe those who didn't get higher amounts didn't live longer. It's just data. Okay, arachidonic acid. Look at this. Wow. For insulin-resistant people, their arachidonic acid, which is supposed to be pro-inflammatory, increased from roughly 8 to, call that 12. That's 50% increase. And it's a much smaller change for non-insulin resistant people. I would argue that it's, it's not even a half a point over 65 years. I'd call that level. So it's an insulin resistant person's issue is to increase their arachidonic acid. Get it measured to know what you're talking about, but that's the pattern that we're seeing here. That's profound. So perhaps the ending thought is, perhaps being whatever perfect is, maybe midpoint is the perfect. Let me just go back there. So midpoint, notice that midpoint. It brings you to midpoint in that range. In those ranges I pointed out, that you have insulin resistant people coming up to midpoint, and you can say non-insulin resistant people are coming down a little bit to midpoint, but midpoint is very specific. And with linoleic acid, it's midpoint. Call that 25. There's midpoint. So it's normalizing. So maybe you should say that 25 for linoleic acid should be the level you should be at. So you get it checked. And by the way, linoleic acid actually has no recommended level by any government authority yet. Okay, arachidonic acid, its midpoint is 12. Maybe that's what you should shoot for and relatively look at your numbers and get to those levels. So the conclusion is midpoint might be perfect, especially as you age. Until next time. So if this is something that you're interested in, that is a topic that I obviously go deeper in terms of labs, in terms of how to do it, in terms of why you would want to do it, various topics, as you've seen that I've done in the past, then please let me know below in a comment. Till then.